Good morning and welcome to the second evidence session of the Work and Pension Select Committee Inquiry into Pensioner Poverty. And it's a pleasure to welcome our panel of witnesses this morning. I'm going to start from the left. I'll need to get my glasses on to read everybody's names to be able to do that. Daniella Jenkins, a very good morning to you. Suzy Morrissey, Sasjkia, Otto and Sue Ferns. But would you like to introduce yourselves and the organisations that you represent, starting with Daniella?
Thank you. So my name is Dr. Daniella Jenkins. I'm a representative today for the Women's Budget Group.
And I'm Dr. Suzy Morrissey. I'm the Deputy Director at the Pensions Policy Institute.
I'm Sasjkia Otto. I am representing the Fabian Society. It's an honour to be here.
I'm Sue Ferns. I'm the Senior Deputy General Secretary at Prospect Trade Union.
Thank you. And I'm going to kick off, and I just wondered if you could give your views in terms of to what extent do you think the solutions about women's pension and poverty differ from the population at large in terms of those groups that are experiencing pension and poverty. Daniella, do you want to kick off?
Thank you. So I think it's firstly important to point out that the majority of pensioners are and always have been women. So when we talk about pensions issues, we're primarily talking about women and women's issues and how that affects women disproportionately in relation to men. There are a number of reasons why women are discriminated against in terms of the pension system, and this leads to ongoing, persistent differences in terms of pensions outcomes for women and for men as well. One of those is mainly labour discrimination, so discrimination within the labour market, because pensions are linked to employment. So if you're discriminated against, whether that's gender pay gaps, whether that's employment discrimination in terms of contracts, the type of work that you do, part-time work, but also unpaid work as well. And so unpaid work, which is largely unrecognised within our state and occupational pension system, all of that, the cumulative effect is that women have less to live on, but the kicker is women are more likely to live longer. So women are living for longer on less income as they get older as well.
Thank you. Suzy, would you like to add to that?
Thank you. Yes, Irene, that really is the key point, that women live longer, they live by themselves, which changes the expenditure profile in retirement, and they have less retirement income for the reasons that Daniella has mentioned in terms of labour market participation. So when we're thinking about pensions, it's an absolutely agendered issue, and it's great to examine that in more detail. I would suggest that maintaining that gender lens is really important through the rest of the pensions work that we're doing.
Sasjkia.
To add to Suzy and Daniella's points, it's a common misconception that all pensioners are well off. That masks significant inequalities within the pensioner population. Over 85s, women in particular, are more likely than most other age groups to be in poverty. The only other age group that's more likely to be in poverty are 60 to 65-year-olds, so those just approaching the state pension age who, of course, have been affected by state pension age increases. And they're more likely to be in poverty than women who are kind of other family stage as well.
Sue.
So I agree with everything the other panellists have said, but really just want to emphasise the importance of the gender pension gap. It's had much less attention than the gender pay gap, despite being twice the size of the pay gap. And as other panellists have said, a variety of reasons for that. But I think one of the most significant is that it's a caring gap as well, and the disproportionate burden on women of caring responsibilities.
Thank you. You mentioned in terms, obviously, women tend to live longer, although that is slightly changing. So they tend to live longer. But are there other issues as well in terms of the depth of poverty that they may experience that you want to expand on?
I'm happy to come in there. So there are specific nuances that affect women. One of those aspects is actually household finances and the distribution of finances within the household as well. And this can affect different cohorts of women in different ways, but we see that works its way through, right the way through when we look at millennial age women, so women who might have been born from the sort of 1980s onwards as well. Sometimes that affects how distribution of finances in terms of income. So income might be pooled, but pensions aren't. So that's one issue. But also the impact of things like divorce. So when relationships end, women may be discriminated against in terms of the distribution of pensions. So it might well be that if they were married, that their husband was building up a higher pension, but then on divorce, they don't necessarily have access to that as well. But we also see that impact of aspects of things like caring, whether that's for children, whether that's for older parents. So we see a lot of older women, for example, caught in that sandwich generation, where they might be taking care of grandchildren, but also taking care of their parents as well, takes them out of the labour market. So that impact of unpaid work affects their employment patterns and further affects what they're able to accumulate in terms of pensions wealth.
Anybody want to add to that?
Just to add to that, so 1/3 of the gender pensions gaps relates to labour market participation, according to research that we undertook at the PPI. So 1/3 of that is essentially the impact of having those care responsibilities. And to the point about divorce, we've only got about 30% of divorce settlements that currently include pensions in the financial settlements. And that's not to say that they're evenly distributed, but there's only about 30% that include them, despite the fact that it's, of course, relationship property. So there are some, big impacts from these points that you made.
Thank you. Daniella, I'll just nip back to you if I may. Thinking about, you've written, I think, that single older women are more likely to experience pension poverty at the moment. Do you think that there will be changes in this with the current young women who are working?
I would have hoped so, but actually there are indications that these issues are both pernicious and they are persistent. Now, some of the causes for that are consistent with older generations, but there are new nuances that are coming through. So we know it's been well established. Legislation went through as far back as 1997 to try and address the issues around divorce and pensions and women. But we know that marriage rates are declining, as also divorce rates are declining. So younger women are less likely to be married and are more likely to be cohabiting. Now, where there are limited rights towards pensions on a relationship ending, for those cohabiting women, they have no rights to pensions at all. We also know that there are things like economic dependence. Many women, younger women, can't afford to live on their own. So we know, for example, that 60% of a woman's, average woman's income, if you want to rent a 2-bedroom home within London, that would be going just towards your housing costs alone. So we know that for a number of women, that if you're unable to be able to purchase a property on your own, for example, you might well be within a relationship where you are either living with somebody who owns that property, you might be cohabiting for those reasons, and all of these reasons that we find that as women get older, they may be bearing those housing costs into older age. They may well not have had rights to somebody's pension, even if they had been living with them for long periods of time. And we also find that there are differences in terms of employment patterns. So, yes, before women might well have stayed at home when they had children, but we also see that even unmarried women, women who are single, might well be self-employed. They might be gig working. They might be having, multiple periods of multiple jobs, for example, not quite reaching the threshold for auto-enrolment, and sometimes, particularly if they are self-employed, for example, not always making contributions towards their state pensions as well. So there are indications, certainly from my research, that some of these issues which specifically affect women might well become acute for those younger generations as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to specifically looking at state pension age. We know that the average in terms of healthy life expectancy for women it's been declining for both men and women, and for anybody who's not aware of what healthy life expectancy is, it's about how long you live in good health. But the average across England is 61.9 years. In my constituency, it's just over 58 years, and in Blackpool, it's just under 53 years. So massive change in how long you can expect or difference rather, how long you can expect to live in good health. Does the social security system provide adequate support to women presently in the pre-pension age? And if it doesn't, what do you think should change?
I'll take it, but I think that my overall view is that there are definitely issues in terms of health. There are definitely issues in terms of inequalities, which are not adequately addressed within our pension system currently. But I think that there are real blind spots in terms of understanding the employment working patterns of women within that sort of later point of sort of 50s towards early 60s. As I've already mentioned, a number of those women might well be undertaking unpaid work. We also have to look at, for those women who are able to take work or do work, what type of work women do. Largely women are doing care work. They might be doing nursing. They might be working in retail. So the majority of work that women do, I'm an academic, I can probably sit at a desk until I'm in my 60s, until my mind goes. But if you are working on your feet, if you are lifting people, for those women, if they do have other ancillary health issues, it's much more likely to affect their ability to be able to access benefits, but also be able to work in order to be able to build up their pensions.
We'd like to add to that. Yes, Sasjkia.
Thank you. So as the state pension age increases, of course, some people would relish the opportunity to kind of, continue working, and I'm very happy to be seen as someone who's, not sort of over the hill, as some people might think of people reaching their 60s. But again, there's significant inequalities, and the state pension age increase is designed to kind of pay for also kind of an increasing state pension. But there's a lot of people who probably aren't going to live long enough to see the full benefits of that increase. There's been a significant spike in poverty in the years leading up to the state pension age. It's something like 1.1 million pensioners in total, and that's been largely driven by an increase in the state pension age over the past decade and a half. The challenge is, I think we can all understand why we need to think about longer working lives, but that hasn't been accompanied by a support package for the people affected. And for women in particular, women and men are about as likely to be disabled. We find that the vast majority of people who are in poverty and not working have some sort of physical health problem. Either they say they're not working because they're ill, or they are, sort of disabled as defined under the Equality Act. But the thing that also kind of gets in women's way, there's a couple of things. Some of the things are barriers to work, and some of them are experiences at work, that work itself creates a barrier to work. Caring responsibilities, a really, really important barrier to work. So what we find as one of the biggest things that women say that could get them back into work if they've already left the labour market is working patterns that are suited to their needs. The problem is, once it's gotten to that point, it's very, very difficult to get people back. The vast majority of people who are not working over the age of 60 have been out of work for 5 years. That's a very, very steep path to returning to the labour market. So we need to make sure that people aren't dropping out in the first place. The thing that we found overwhelmingly for women, different to men, or more so than men, is that they say that the thing that would keep them in the labour market, if they were thinking of leaving early, is actually a work environment that isn't too stressful. We need to think about how work contributes to driving people out of the labour market, and how we can improve the experiences at work and people's health at work.
Anybody else?
Just in terms of pre-retirement benefits, but also benefits that extend past SPA, a key one for consideration that we haven't mentioned yet would be housing benefit. So just as we're seeing those patterns of home ownership decline and more people staying in rented accommodation through later life, you did touched on the cost of that. So, but how the housing benefit works, the extent to which that is maintained appropriately and available for women, I think is a key part of considerations. Very conscious that, you know, our research has indicated we'll have another 420,000 households needing housing benefit over the coming years. So just a big increase and something to think about.
Can we hear from Sue, then back to you, Sasjkia.
I just wanted to make one brief comment, actually, in relation to the increase in state pension age, and thinking particularly not just about women caring in their families, but women who are in the caring professions, and the fact that that is often very physically demanding work, and that is a workforce that is overwhelmingly female, and sometimes it's just not possible to work to a rise in state pension age because of those physical demands.
Thank you. Sasjkia, very briefly, if you could.
Just on the point of there not being a support package in place, if people can't keep working for whatever reason because of the barriers they experience to work, we need to think about the benefit system. So universal credit is worth about a third of pension credit. The result is that people are in poverty as a result. We need to think about how long people have been out of work, their health, whether they've had caring responsibilities recently, which meant they had to leave work, and whether or not we need to smooth the transition to the state pension age by raising working age benefits for certain people.
Final one from me. In terms of the pension review that the government postponed on pension adequacy, what do you think the focus should be when it is finally does happen? Who wants to kick off with that one?
I'm happy to take that.
Okay, Suzy.
So obviously we're looking forward to the second part of the review when it does happen. For us, we've always looked at pensions as part of the system, not in isolation, and I think that's become more so nowadays. We've mentioned health, mentioned housing. It's very difficult to view pensions in isolation from these other aspects. What are people actually going to need to be spending their money on? Social care is obviously another aspect of that. So I think from the PPI perspective, it would be great if we could look at the issue of pension adequacy in the round of all of those other issues that we need to consider, and making sure that we are considering individual needs. They are not going to be the same across the country. You've mentioned differences in life expectancy. We have differences in expenditure for heating costs depending on where you live. There are all manner of variables to consider, and so just taking that lens of intersectionality would be a really good way of proceeding.
Thank you, Sasjkia.
I think we need to consider what the state pension is for. So at the moment, the state pension is set around the poverty line, a little bit higher maybe. The latest data we have is 22-23. But it can't guarantee protection from poverty for a couple of reasons. One is contribution rates, and the other one is housing costs, because although it's set at the poverty line, it's sort of poverty line before housing costs. So, and housing costs includes things like water rates, council tax, insurance. So first of all, we need to think, okay, is there a minimum standard of living that every pensioner should be guaranteed in retirement? What is that standard of living? Should it be the poverty line or some sort of other factor that takes into account essential expenses? And then how do we ensure that people reach that level? Do we have to do things like relax contribution rules, for example, or potentially set a target for where the state pension needs to kind of be reached? So just to briefly say, again, because over 85s are, of course, the ones that are most likely to be in poverty, one of the things that our research finds is that extending the new state pension to everyone, no questions asked, isn't actually that much more expensive than just means, sort of giving everyone sort of a means-tested support. And of course, is very difficult for means testing to reach over 85s for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Thank you.
So we think there should be a major focus on the gender pension gap, which is partly a pensions policy issue, but it's important, I think, to look at the related policy areas around the labour market, around caring responsibilities and so on. And one thing we'd really like it to look at is the position of freelancers in the labour market, where pension provision is absolutely dire. We represent about 30,000 freelance workers, and often they're on contracts that are so short that they're not able even to be automatically enrolled before that contract ends, and then they move on to another one. And given the growing numbers of freelance workers across the economy, this is going to become a more and more significant issue. Don't think it's had very much attention at the moment.
It's a very good point. Thank you so much. Jill German.
Thank you, Chair. So we've heard this morning that the journey towards women being less well off in retirement isn't one that suddenly becomes an issue at pensionable age. It's a journey through the woman's life, and I think caring responsibility is particularly pertinent. And when I think of my own constituency, that's very much writ large around me. That this starts really early on. That journey towards poverty in later age is definitely along the way. So I'm interested how we measure the gender pensions gap, and if it's currently possible to identify which women may be at risk of pensioner poverty, taking into consideration what we know, and from existing data, and who should be prioritised much earlier. And if that doesn't exist, then how could we produce that to help this?
I'm happy to. So, recent research that we've done shows that the women who have the lowest retirement incomes are those women who've experienced single parenthood at some point during their early life, or have experienced divorce in earlier parts of their life course. So, and obviously those two can go together. So these kind of elements of things that can happen to women are really key indicators of their later life outcomes. So if you're looking to think about targeting or the cohorts that you might want to think about, these are the women for whom currently their retirement incomes are much lower. So part of that might be settlements, but taking the point if they weren't married. But so these are the kinds of women that you might be thinking about. If that helps.
I think the point about caring, is really important, but it's really important that we recognise the spectrum of what care looks like. Care is childcare. Care is looking after parents. Care is looking after people with disabilities. Care is taking care of your child who perhaps has been excluded from school. So women tend to do all of that unpaid work, which is partly taking them out of the labour market, which is partly affecting their ability to be able to build up, but equally recognising the fact that not all of those women are recognised as carers within the system and able to access benefits. So I think there is definitely a vulnerability that those women aren't seen. I think gender pay gap reporting is extremely important, but it's also important to recognise that a number of those freelancers that we're talking about, for example, aren't captured. We know that there's work happening at the moment to look at workers' rights and how people access, and that will affect how people access things like auto-enrolment. Again, at the moment, they sort of sit within that grey labour market where those reports don't really pick up people who are working on contracts that don't necessarily bring them into auto-enrolment. But the biggest factor, I think, the blind spot, is around wealth. And wealth is linked to intergenerational inequalities as well. We know, particularly within the millennial age population that I've studied, that actually intergenerational wealth will make a huge difference. If your parents owned a property, you're going to have very different financial outcomes from if your parents didn't. And so recognizing that there is a generation of people who are super vulnerable, they're going to need pensions much more than people who will have property wealth, whether that comes from their parents, whether that's their ability to be able to access sort of property wealth as well. So I think it's really important to recognise that some people are going to rely on their pensions much more in older age, and we need to identify who those people are much earlier within their life courses.
And is there data that exists that you're aware of that's looking at these groups at present?
No. So I think I think this issue around effectively, intergenerational wealth transfers and inheritance is a blind spot, and it's something that we don't look at, that we don't understand. We look at income, but we're not necessarily comparing like with like. If we are really recognising the fact that your parents' financial status and social status has a real material impact on your own financial outcomes later in life.
Sasjkia, do you want to come in?
I don't want to pretend to be an expert here, but I do have a little bit of a background in data and policy. I wonder, so HMRC will have data on pensions contributions. The pensions dashboard, when that materialises, will kind of also bring together data from different pensions pots. And of course, HMRC will have kind of data on earnings and how much of the state pension people have kind of accumulated throughout their lifetimes. I think there's a whole different piece of work to be done on kind of how you bring all those different pieces of data together, and then also what you do with it, because it's all very well to say, oh, you've got a bunch of people who are going to be, living in poverty in retirement, or, below the minimum income standard, which is the sort of standard that the public think is acceptable for someone at a certain life stage. But actually, perhaps there needs to be targeted interventions. So if you know who those people are, by bringing these different data sources together, maybe you need to think about, okay, so do you need to let them know that they need to save more, or if it's not realistic for them to save more because they're already on a low income, are there other interventions that government can come up with early on to make sure that we're not in the same position we are now 30 years down the line?
It seems that there is, there's definitely potential for a much more proactive approach, because if we know all these years ahead that this is the trajectory that somebody's on,
yes,
then the potential appears to be there to be able to do something about it much earlier.
Correct. But again, I want to caveat that by saying I haven't done detailed research on this, and that's a whole new piece of work.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. So
I just wanted to make a slightly different point about however you measure the gender pension gap, and there are different ways of doing it, the results are broadly consistent. And one thing that Laura Trott did do as Pensions Minister was to publish a government view of what the gender pension gap is. I think it's really important that that isn't a one-off exercise. The government's measure, as it was then anyway, is derived from data that's published biennially. So we would want to see that at least biennially published to Parliament alongside targets for reducing the gender pension gap and a plan about how we think that can be achieved. I think that's really important for some of the points you've been making, because so many people, so many women are unaware of the trajectory that they're on. Mm-hmm. We have a figure, we publish a figure, we set targets. That is a really good way to bring it to more wider attention as well. So it's in some ways very straightforward, but it's not happening, and it needs to happen.
Much more focus and regularity. Yeah. Thank you. I think my colleague Joanna wanted to come in.
All right. And I should just declare before I start that I know Sue because we used to work for the same organisation. So. Just on the gender pensions gap then, and the report that was published, and it's helpful, Sue, that you've said one of the lessons from that should be that it's published more regularly, that there should be targets, but I'm conscious that you've estimated that the gender pensions gap would not be eliminated until 2088. Do you want to say a little more about how you think we could bring that down?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we said that on the basis of current trends and what is happening at the moment. So I think there's a number of things that could help with that. Firstly, in terms of caring responsibilities, credit in the pension system for women who are doing those caring responsibilities. I think there are things that employers can do as well by giving pension credit for women who are on maternity leave, for example, or for parental leave. We do need better rights for cohabiting couples more pension sharing orders on divorce, and better provision for surviving partners in DC schemes. We have, of course, in recent years seen that shift from DB, where survivors would automatically be entitled to pension benefit, to DC, where it's much now more a matter of choice, and it doesn't happen automatically. So those are a few things that could happen. But I think government should also look to the public sector. There are some very big employers in the public sector which have even bigger pension schemes. We measured the civil service gender pension gap at 44%, for example. I think the local government pension scheme is the one that's really only addressing this actively at the moment. So I think there should be a recommendation and a requirement on those major pension schemes to do some analysis and to take action to narrow their pension gaps.
And how frequently would you expect to see publication of a report on the gender pensions gap?
I think at least every couple of years. Regularity is what's most important, I think, regularity of reporting. But certainly when you think about the public sector schemes, there's scheme advisory boards, these are unionised workforces, there should be discussions taking place on at least a biennial basis, in the same way as organisations are required to report on the gender pay gap.
Thank you.
That's Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks so much so far. I think it's been really, really fascinating. I think, in terms of financial resilience, I think it would be useful to understand the financial resilience between men and women at pensionable age, but also at that sort of pre-pension stage. So I was wondering how many women are reliant on state pension as their main source of income, and how does that differ between men and women?
More women than men rely on the state pension as their main source of income, she says, flicking through her notes to find it. You can find it there. I think it's 67%. But yes, so more women than men are reliant. So that's a key piece, and it speaks to the reporting that we were talking about before, because that would need to talk about the pensions gap within private pensions but also in public pensions, so that you could see the impact of the changes that have been made with respect to care credits coming through, just as a point. So I think the financial resilience and broadly financial capability piece is a really interesting one. It is quite gendered. We know that women actually often run household budgets and have a lot of financial skills, and yet sometimes when we start to talk about things with different words like investment and other things, that can start to feel less comfortable space for women, which is not to say that they don't in fact have skills that can be employed in that area, but I think as with anything, it's very much about how you pitch that. So I think the resilience capability piece is really worth exploring and thinking about how we're messaging conversations, because to the point, if we've identified some cohorts that might be benefited from specific assistance, we would need to make sure that the way that we're communicating with them would be in ways that resonate and work with them. So as ever, just a gender lens over any of those points would be really useful.
I think it's really important to make that link between working life and the life that you live as a pensioner, for example, and that does affect different cohorts differently. I think it's really important when we recognise pensioner poverty, and many of the women who are pensioners at the moment, these are women who were working in the 1970s, the 1980s. These are not periods of time which were particularly well known and renowned for recognising women's rights within the workplace. A number of those rights came in from the late 90s onwards, and so we recognise that a number of those women are now paying the price for the discrimination that they faced within the labour market at the time. A number of women were excluded from occupational pension schemes. It wasn't that they didn't make the choice, it wasn't that they didn't know, it wasn't until 1997 that it was outlawed to ban women, or people, mainly women, from joining occupational pension schemes because they worked part-time. We also know that the most generous pension schemes still tend to be associated with industries, occupations that tend to be dominated by men as well. And so given the fact that women tend to work in lower paid roles, they're earning less, they have less generous occupational pension schemes, and as you say, that reliance on state pensions, because women were less likely to have or be able to build up these generous occupational pension schemes. That's one of the reasons why they are now subsisting, living on the state pension or reliant on that state pension, was because they didn't necessarily have those opportunities to build up good occupational pensions at the point at which they were working.
Sorry, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Just to add to the building up point, our research finds that women also, women who are not working and living in poverty, also use their occupational pension to tide them over until the state pension age. And they're more likely to do so at men. They're more likely to draw their pension early. And a really interesting thing is that this sometimes comes at the expense of claiming the benefits that they might be entitled to, because pension income is offset pound for pound against benefits. So if you claim a pension, you can't get the benefits for that amount. And I think that there is a lack of information in that space. A lot of people are using, both men and women more so than men, using their private pension to get them to the state pension age, even if they're living in poverty, and cutting back on how much they spend, rather than going out and getting more work, which comes with the challenges that we just discussed before.
Lovely. I mean, I think one of the things that are in the paperwork that we received is just obviously poverty increases as pensioners age, but clearly part of that is because women live longer. There are more in each group as they get older. I thought that was really interesting. In terms of the state pension being main income, how does that deliver against adequacy benchmarks for income in retirement?
So the full state pension is only just meeting the PLSA retirement living standards. So we've talked about it previously as offering kind of a minimum protection, minimum amount. And obviously, individual circumstances will depend on the extent to which there is private pension income alongside that. But currently, that's where the state pension is sitting as a sort of accepted, if that's indeed the case, a kind of minimum standard. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And how does it vary for different age groups of women? So, for example, age, those who are single at the point of retirement, those that actually become single in retirement, and obviously picking up the point that Daniella made on intergenerational wealth. How does that vary for different groups of women? In terms of their sort of the pension being their main income, and the way in which poverty increases as people age.
I don't have this report, but I know who does. Just to bring it with me, so I might provide you a reference afterwards.
So certainly we have evidence about the lower income in retirement of women who've experienced those instances, as I said, single parenthood and divorce in earlier life. We know that those women are the women who are having lower incomes in retirement. I don't have the retirement age data for you today.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. John Milne.
Thanks, Chair. The Triple Lock has done a fantastic job at raising UK pensions into more or less the middle of the pack since it was introduced under the coalition government. However, it is at heart just a mathematical formula. Do you think it's still the right mathematical formula, or do you, for example, think it needs some sort of social objective added to it? Sasjkia, you actually answered somewhat to this already earlier. Perhaps you'd like to start.
Thank you. Just to say, the UK state pension, the UK sort of government spending as a proportion of GDP on pensions is very low by international standards. My answer to your question, I think, is a sort of a values-based question that the government needs to answer. As we've said before, the state pension, the Turner Commission set a target for the state pension of 30% of median incomes. That's been reached now. But the state pension can't guarantee protection from poverty in retirement, one, because of contribution gaps, and two, because of housing costs. So the government needs to take a view whether the state pension needs to be increased to kind of make up for those things to a point where where pension and poverty is sort of addressed more extensively, or whether there are other mechanisms to kind of address pension and poverty. I would say that you'd have to raise the state pension by quite a lot to get to all renters. I can get you the figures in a second. But even if you raise the state pension to the minimum income standard, which is higher than the poverty line, people who are renting, I think something like a quarter would still be living in poverty. So a kind of universal kind of level of support that everyone is entitled to still isn't going to get people above the poverty line, or sort of to a decent standard of living, not everyone. So is there sort of a role for cost of living support? Does government need to look at, kind of how do we support people what kind of housing reforms do we need to take into account? And I think that the IFS has made an interesting proposal on the bedroom tax. So of course the bedroom tax applies, isn't applied if you're living in socially rented accommodation, but you are still kind of, if you've got more bedrooms than is sort of deemed suitable for your household size, and you're in private rented accommodation, you sort of get a housing benefits penalty. So maybe look at something like that as well. I think that there's a sort of detailed process you need to go through. My research hasn't made that recommendations. I think you need to take into account things like private pensions as well. But the effects of private pension reforms are going to take decades to feed through. At the moment, the lowest earners still aren't kind of saving enough, and that's not going to happen overnight. That's going to happen over 30 years' time.
Thank you.
So the triple lock is obviously one way of protecting the pension from inflation, but obviously there are other mechanisms that could be used, and that would be a political decision as to which one you chose to take. I think the key thing is that to ensure that it has a level of inflation protection. I think from a policy perspective, there is that question about what you want the state pension to do, the extent to which you think it should be able to cover all of those types of expenses, or whether you're more happy with an approach that provides layers of targeted, specific additional support for additional costs. So housing is one, energy costs is another. And taking an approach like that allows you to direct that expenditure precisely to those people who are incurring those specific costs and may not have the income to meet them, rather than using the state pension to do it, which is a blanket approach by which everyone is raised, but it may not be that everyone who's in receipt of the state pension needs that additional income.
Thank you.
But just to say again, over 85s, over 80s, they're at greater risk of poverty, and it doesn't, there's not much in it to kind of just give everyone a new state pension, regardless of contribution rules. You can lift quite a lot of people out of poverty, and the cost would be very similar.
I was just going to say, colleagues are more expert on this than I am, just mindful of the potential tension between targeted or means-tested benefits and the drive to automatic enrolment, particularly if putting more money into a pension has implications for your income and therefore your eligibility for means-tested benefits. There's a potential tension there, I think. And of course the fact that means-tested benefits are underclaimed as well, which is another issue to think about. And even those who do claim them, it doesn't necessarily take them out of living in poverty.
Daniella?
I think one thing that we should all recognise is that triple lock has really helped pensioners, and has really improved what was an inadequate state pension, deeply inadequate for, a number of years. So I think, successive governments should be congratulated for maintaining that, recognising that the majority of pensioners are women. So we're lifting a number of women and putting them in a better financial position that they would have been in otherwise in old age. I think the point may have been sort of lost, but Sasjkia was making that also recognising that even with an increasingly, generous state pension, a number of women don't get their full state pension. Partly because that's linked again to employment patterns and working patterns, partly also linked because as well some of those older women, there was a sort of dependence model, so you were getting your stamps through your husband, for example, and that's affected women, so they're living with the legacy of those sort of policies now within older age. I think there are questions about pension credits and how there's eligibility and how that interacts and whether that is the right mechanism, things like the savings credit element of pensions credit, which was taken away as triple lock sort of came into play. That, again, there are some women who are affected by that and the cliff edge that happens. So you either get pensions credit and that opens up lots of other things, or you don't. And the difference that makes is so significant, and that really does affect a number of women. So I think how we think about how the state pension interacts with other benefits, housing benefit, pensions credit, whether there is the possibility for tapering eligibility for things like pensions credit as well. So rather than I make the threshold, yes, I've got it, but actually, could I get a bit that could help me through? And equally, I think that, we often talk about, means testing, and there are horrible legacies around means testing, that people are quite rightly suspicious about people having to prove how poor they are, and people don't want to do that. People are proud. They don't want to have to sort of go cap in hand. Maybe they weren't claiming benefits when they were at working age, so why would they feel the need to be able to do that now? And there's, £1.5 billion unclaimed in terms of pension credits, and some people who may never want to go in that form. But one of my arguments is that, I have to pay back a student loan. Like, I don't have to, go and knock on the door. We have the mechanisms to work out eligibility in working age. We really should be able to extend those and to change that, to change the burden of responsibility for people having to step into the system, that we should be able to bring them into the system and recognise that need.
On benefits take-up, I think it's worth noting that the level is so low that even if every single pensioner claimed the benefits they're entitled to, which is of course a very steep hurdle, you would shift pensioner poverty by 1 or 2 percentage points.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thanks. Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning. And we are now steering straight into means-tested benefits, you'll be pleased to know. And I'm sure we could have a lengthy session on the merits and challenges associated with means-testing benefits. But I would just be keen to draw out a wee bit more from you on some of the points that you have mentioned this morning around the effectiveness of the means-tested system and preventing women from at pension age from falling into poverty, and what you would, I suppose, prioritise to make that more effective. So maybe Daniella, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things to sort of, again, bring out is that pension credits isn't just about getting pension credits, it's about some of the other things that it unlocks as well. So whether that's, even things like the TV licence. So there's lots of things that are linked to pension credits. So it is almost like, winning a prize if you do get into that system. Right? So I think recognising that so much hinges on pension credit, that if that continues, and again, that's a policy decision, then really there is an onus to bring as many people into that system as possible. At its most basic level, information. Letting people know and understand. You may not think of yourself as somebody who is eligible for pension credits, and I know that there have been recent campaigns around that, but equally allowing people to be able to make calculations that are reasonable, that are easy enough for for people to be able to understand. You know, it is still quite a complex system. I think examining again that intersection between things like savings and pensions credits is worthwhile revisiting that and some of the assumptions around that. And I do recognise the logic at the time. You know, if the state pension gets more generous, then fewer people would need pension credits. Again, a number of people have mentioned housing. You know, and we can see that a lot of the assumptions around the pension system going back, 20 to 30 years were, by this point in time, we'll all be homeowners. And so by the time you get to, old age, we won't have, home, mortgage costs, for example, renting costs, but equally you might be able to unlock other things because you own a property. Now, we know that we are looking at generations of lifetime renters, and not lifetime people on housing benefit, lifetime renters. And we really need to be able to understand how housing costs are covered throughout the life course, for example, and how that intersects with pension credits and other forms of benefit as well, because that really hasn't been examined.
Yes, housing benefit interaction is probably the key area for consideration. The other area is the social care, and when you start to get into those kind of needs for that kind of higher level of accommodations specific needs. So I think those are a couple of key areas where needs testing applies and has great impact on pensioners overall, but women in particular.
Couples on an equivalised basis receive a much lower level of support than single people. So one of the kind of earlier things you can do to lift pensioners out of poverty is to kind of raise the level of support for couples to an equivalised sort of to the equivalent of what single people receive, kind of controlling for household size. But even then, linking with what's been said about, on poverty and home ownership, you're going to end up with 27% of renters, private renters, 21% of social renters, 14% with the mortgage, and 11% of home owners still in poverty if you do that. Take-up is really, really important, of course, alongside considering levels. I think we need to consider data-driven approaches for promoting take-up. Again, this is a whole another piece of research, but and I know it came up when the Secretary of State gave evidence on this last year. I would be very interested to see a more detailed analysis of whether the government's existing Notify system, which is what was used to send text messages to people during the pandemic, could be used to let pensioners who might be eligible for pension credit know, because that's quite an accessible format. And I know that there's a sort of conversation ongoing around the automation of benefits uptake. I just want to not caution about it. I'm very enthusiastic about the opportunities presented by technologies. But we submitted a Freedom of Information request to DWP and found that 100,000 pensioners are on a debt repayment plan to DWP. So if they're only living on the state pension, or if they're only living on means-tested benefits, then that's going to put them into poverty. If you're automating benefits uptake and there's a mistake, then that's going to kind of erode trust. It's going to, potentially put pensioners into debt, and really the kind of you would need access to people's information on kind of household savings to do that, which of course is information that's held by banks. One thing that the government might consider doing, and there's already sort of private sector technology on this, is explore with banks whether they could let people know, based on their account information, that they might qualify for benefits. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation here.
I've nothing to add to what colleagues have already said. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I suppose if I could maybe focus, Suzy, you mentioned at the start of the session specifically around housing benefit. So maybe to yourself and Sasjkia, we know the importance of housing benefit linked to, for example, women fleeing domestic abuse and those with caring responsibilities as highlighted earlier on. We also know the government is committed to try and improve the administration linking pension credit to housing benefit. So I'm keen just to maybe get some more information out of both yourself, Suzy, and Sasjkia, around how effective housing benefit actually is at supporting those women who are above pension age, and if there are any specifics at this point that you could say, you know, that the government, specific steps that the government could take to make that more effective.
I think key area is the accessibility of being able to apply and get those credits, and it speaks to the system as a whole. Once we give a lot of our personal information in with respect to one benefit, say housing benefit, it would be great if we were actually able to use that information for other things that we might be able to be entitled to, rather than have to have another appointment with another person to tell them the same things to get access to, for example, some other form of support like attendance and arts or whatever it might be. So I think there's something about taking a holistic picture when someone comes into the system asking for a particular type of benefit, or if we reach out to an individual on this. I think there is something about how the system can kind of work as a wraparound, recognising that there may be, as you said, once you're into pension credit, there's a number of other things that you can get. So I think housing benefit could be one area where we start to open that door. I don't have any more specific data for you today other than that we know that it's a valuable benefit. We know that we expect more and more people to need it over the short term, and I think it presents a clear opportunity to kind of engage with the system in a way that people who haven't necessarily engaged with the welfare system over their life course might not be used to doing, because going on to state pension is quite a relatively easy access into welfare provision, and they might not be used to the other ways of doing it. And I think also we do need to be quite mindful of an individual basis, and when we're doing that, I know that there are a number of people for whom a technology-driven approach would not necessarily support them as they get older and have greater requirements. So I think that would be the other thing that I would just add, that as with everything in life, a range of ways, so that recognising the diversity that we all bring to the situation would be really important.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's two issues. One is the level, another one is take up. Of people who receive housing benefit, 250,000 single women and 100,000 single men do not receive the full amount of rent. That's kind of for a variety of different reasons, including, as I discussed before, the private sector bedroom tax. We also modelled what would happen if everyone who's entitled to housing benefit claimed it, and you would get 70,000 single women and 40,000 single men out of poverty. I mentioned before that there's I think it depends what you're trying to achieve with any sort of means-tested or other intervention. If you're trying to get people out of a specific poverty threshold, and there's different measures of poverty. There's income-based poverty, which is the government standard measure, which is 60% of the median after housing costs. But housing costs, which is kind of what people generally use, but the government is also developing another measure, which is households pay below average resources, which takes into account the cost of care, energy, etc. But if you're just taking the current standard measure, you've got council tax, you've got water rates, you've got a bunch of other stuff that's included in that measure. So I don't know if it's that helpful to just think about that, or think about sort of the cost of living a little bit more holistically. This is a tricky one. It's very, very difficult to get right, and it's very, very difficult to target. But thinking about something like, is there, in the same way that housing benefits say that we don't, someone's income shouldn't drop below a certain level after housing costs, assuming that sort of a certain level of, reasonable level of expenditure on housing, is there a certain principle, similar principle that should apply to utilities, and can that be co-funded by utilities companies? But then, of course, there's other things that you need to think about, like is that cost going to get passed on to other people? So there's a whole cost of living is so important, and we've done focus groups, and we find that actually more than income, people really feel at all ages really feel the impact of cost of living, and I think that's government really needs to think about, in addition to benefits, what can it do structurally in the long term to address cost of living challenges, and of course is there near-term support that should be targeted at specific people.
I'm very conscious of time, sorry Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Steve Darling.
Thank you. So I think I've got about 2.5 minutes on this question. And it's on WASPI women, and WASPI women are clearly mostly now into retirement. I'm going to ask both questions because otherwise I'll be guillotined.
You won't, Steve. Carry on.
Carry on. The first one I wanted to explore was levels of poverty within WASPI women, that cohort of ladies. I think you've already to a certain extent down to this, but some application around that area would be really helpful. The other area that I'd welcome some exploration of, some of it we've already touched on, which is kind of like the cultural issues around ladies of that age. You've already alluded to that perhaps, well, you've hinted at, but it's reasonable for me to assume that perhaps it was the male managing the finance within the household, and so women are perhaps of that age less confident around managing finances. That's a big assumption. I know there are very capable women of that age who are perfectly able to manage much better than men on many occasions. But those cultural pressures around that world that may have impacted on people's ability to take account of the changes that the Ombudsman found maladministration on.
I'm happy to start with that. So I don't have full data on the WASPI women, specifically how many are living in poverty, but I do know that women make up more than 2/3 of pensioners currently living in poverty, and 50% of pensioners in poverty are single women. So again, just targeting and thinking about those women who are single, and we know that those are disproportionately affected. Interestingly, in relation to WASPI women, it may not be the right forum, but my mother is a WASPI woman. Right? My mother was born in the 1950s, and I knew that she was a WASPI woman before WASPI was a thing. And I think we didn't have a word for it. All we knew was that there was a problem with her state pension and her friends and her family. And the decisions that they had made, my mother worked in the public sector her whole life. She worked in the NHS, she taught. The decisions that she made, whether it was not working because she was taking care of children, not working because she was taking care of family members, working part-time so she could be there when we came home from school. It wasn't necessarily about knowledge, about finances. It was because she wasn't thinking that by the time she got to that stage in life that she would suddenly have to, take account for all of those things. That she said that she was unusual in that she went to work. It was expected that once she'd had children that she would be at home. And so I think that a number of those women, it's not just that they didn't understand about finances. We put a lot of that kind of mental burden, but we also think about the choices that they made throughout their lives that actually led them to the point where they were caught out effectively because the other decisions that they'd made previously suddenly crystallized at the point when they needed it the most.
Thank you.
Similarly, I don't have data on WASPI women, but suffice to say that it has been great to see the changes that have come through in terms of those credits, those NI credits and contribution years that will support future generations of women. That's great. And for those women that have been captured by the issues related to the WASPI women and the changes, that's an area where it's important to look at individual circumstances and support people as they go through.
Just coming back to the point on, we have an ongoing process of state pension age increases, and there is an opportunity to put in place a support package for people, during those years leading up to the state pension age. The poverty rate for people kind of just after the state pension age up until the age of 70, which would be WASPI women, is fairly similar for men and women. I don't have the data on the sort of 2-year period that were particularly affected by delays in notifications of the state pension age increase.
Thank you.
And that concludes our questions from this panel. Can I thank all of you for the really insightful information that you've brought to us, and we'll now move on to the second panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to welcome our second panel, who are representatives of the WASPI group, Debbie Spon and Angela Maiden. Thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself very briefly, please?
I'm Angela Madden, and I'm the chair of the WASPI campaign.
And I'm Debbie Spon, and I'm the communications director for the WASPI campaign.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to Steve Darling for the first question.
Thank you. So thank you very much for making yourselves available today to come before the committee. It's really appreciated. So the Ombudsman found maladministration when he explored this area. I just wondered if you could unpack for us how this impacted on WASPI women, and whether the other area that I'd be really grateful for you to unpick for us as well is whether this impacted differently on different sectors of WASPI women in your understanding of the challenges that your group face.
Shall I start perhaps with an overview of where we are now? I think it would be fair to say that WASPI women are really angry after the response to the Ombudsman's advice. And not without justification, because we worked and we paid national insurance and we looked after children and we cared for our elderly relatives. And many of the things that Daniella referred to today will resonate very closely with WASPI women's experience. We approached our retirement and found that the government increased our state pension age by up to 6 years, and if that wasn't enough, they didn't tell us that they were going to do that. Our campaign has never been about the loss of state pension, but it's been about the lack of notice that women received and the impact that that had on those women. We've campaigned for 10 years, so it's our 10-year anniversary, and 6 of those was an Ombudsman's investigation. And we awaited the result, and we were exonerated, so we were very delighted. The Ombudsman found that there had been maladministration. However, the DWP doesn't accept the findings. So WASPI women are upset and angry, and they feel let down and they feel betrayed, and they don't understand how it's possible that findings of maladministration have been shown, but it doesn't lead to redress for them.
Anybody else who wants to come in as well?
The impact of maladministration. I mean, what happened, as you know, is we're all women affected by the same injustice, but you're right, it does affect people in different ways. Numerous women who worked maybe full-time had given up work to care for elderly relatives. We did plan for our retirement. Mostly that's what we hear from our members. We planned for our retirement, but we expected that retirement to start at 60. And if you've already given up work in your late 50s, maybe in your mid-50s, depending on what your circumstances are, 4, 5, 6 years later, whenever you heard about the law changing, it's very, very difficult to get back in, because I believe certainly for us there was discrimination in the workplace, and I believe discrimination, age discrimination, still exists in the workplace. The earlier panel I heard saying, people do get into poverty while they're waiting for their state pension now in their early 60s, and perhaps that's because they can't get the same level of work that they got when they were younger. Who knows? Skills lapse. Nurses, their accreditation runs out after 2 or 3 years, and if they thought they were retiring forever, they don't renew that, and then to renew that after a gap is very difficult for them. And many people had to take more poorly paid work during those years, if they could get that work, to get by. Some people were lucky enough to have savings, and of course those who, it was a huge level of retirement income that we lost, £50,000 in some cases, and many of us had to use our savings, or rather than helping our families in the way that we would have liked to, our families had to help us, and that felt demeaning. The women who had those assets, like their savings or perhaps houses, they perhaps had to sell their houses and move into rented accommodation, which then has a huge impact on their lives in the future. We've heard of some women house sharing with strangers. Now, we did that when we were students. We certainly didn't expect to do it at this stage of our lives. So women have been impoverished by the way we've been treated. We are now shocked again because the Ombudsman suggested that we were being compensated for stress, lack of notice, the anxiety, the shock, all the adjustments we had to make, some that we couldn't make, and the compensation recommended by them is a very small sum because of that. 3,000 maximum for anyone suffering from those injustices. And that really adds more injury to the injustices we've already suffered. And our campaign has always been about securing the redress for injustice, not about returning the lost state pension.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Jill German.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us. So you've already mentioned that you've been campaigning since 2015, so fair to say it's been a long road. And so we're under a new government, and the DWP under that government has accepted the maladministration and committed to learning from it, which I think when we look back at some of the stages before, would seem to be a development. I wondered what you thought about this. So bearing in mind that previously the DWP didn't accept that there was any maladministration, is this a significant development to have that acknowledgement?
Well, yes, we welcome the acknowledgement and the apology. And we also welcome the fact that things will change in the future, but it's too late for WASPI women. The damage has been done for us. And the redress that we're seeking is acknowledgement, and for the stress and worry, because for the women who found out with very short notice that they weren't going to be receiving their state pension, it put their retirement plans completely into turmoil. And women report to us the distress that it has caused them, and so that's what the compensation is for. And it's right that the government consider how things could improve in the future, but for us it's too late. The damage has been done.
I'd like to just build a bit on that about the DWP disagreeing with the PHSO. And one of the questions I have to ask is, when did they actually disagree with the PHSO? Because their evidence in 2005 said that they decided that letters should be sent to women affected at that time because they knew that a majority of women didn't know about the change to their state pension age. I think that referred to a 2004 survey where at least 50% of WASPI women whose pension age was changing from 60 to 65 still thought their state pension was 60. So they had evidence at that time that they relied on. And of course the Ombudsman agreed with that evidence and also noted that they didn't act on it quickly enough. Even though that decision was made in 2005, they still didn't start sending letters to women until 2009. And they could have started sending them much earlier. Some women could have had nearly 4 years more notice than they got from the Ombudsman, from the DWP according to the Ombudsman, and that would have given them a lot more time to adjust their retirement plans. For me and others, that additional notice would have meant that I might not have stopped working full-time to care. I might have chosen to share caring with part-time working. And of course, the PHSO and the DWP says that decision doesn't lead to direct financial loss. But the result of that financial decision, the result of that decision has a huge impact financially. If I'd had that extra notice, it would have saved me a lot of money. But I lost that opportunity to make that decision. And that's what lost opportunity actually means here. You know, it's not something like missing out on going to a concert or, missing a birthday or something. It's an actual decision that made an incredible difference to your life.
Thank you. If I could just follow up quickly. So you've spoken about how there's quite significant amounts of money that you feel that women have lost as a result of the maladministration, which is clearly there as being recognised and that it absolutely mustn't happen again. So do you think that the amount that the Ombudsman has recommended is a fairly small amount? So I wondered what your thoughts were on the impact of that broad brush approach, I suppose, to support those women who were particularly financially left worse off.
Well, when we spoke at the committee the last time, of course some of you weren't here then, we spoke about an additional process for claiming if you could prove that you'd had significant financial loss. And I think the committee agreed and wrote to the Department of Work and Pensions at the time, asking for this two-pronged approach, so that what the Ombudsman recommended was for everyone who'd suffered from the injustice, which suggested a rules-based system for that, but then to run alongside an application-based system, which wouldn't be overly onerous, but would allow people to prove that their financial losses were greater than the report went into.
So in addition to?
In addition to, yes, and running alongside a more complete rules-based system.
And for some women, £1,000 or up to £3,000 compensation will make a big difference to them. Even though it doesn't cover what they might have lost, it's an acknowledgement that there has been a maladministration. An acceptance of that, absolutely, yeah. Because we feel disempowered, we feel we're sort of being airbrushed out of history almost. Sort of move on. We've done the WASPI issue, and it hasn't been resolved as far as WASPI women are concerned by any means.
Thank you.
Baxter.
Thank you for taking the time to come and see us today. I just wanted to turn to the issue of communication, because a lot of discussion has focused on letters and whether or not there would have been an impact, material impact, of sending letters at an earlier stage. What's your view on that?
Well, I think sending letters is absolutely vital, and I think there's this question of whether women would have read the letters or not. I think if you'd got a letter and it came in a brown envelope and it said, this contains significantly important information about your retirement future, you must read this, it would have been different. And it would have been different too if the letters that we had sent had included detailed information so that women were very clear about what the implication was for them, or saying to them, if you're not sure about this, make inquiries, contact the pensions service. So I think that there was a lot more that could have been done with those letters. And we don't agree that women wouldn't have read the letters, because if women hadn't read their letters when they started sending them out in 2009, there wouldn't have been a WASPI campaign. And the DWP have sent out letters to millions of people about the removal of the winter fuel allowance. So presumably they acknowledge that it is a worthwhile exercise when you're trying to communicate important information to people.
Given the sort of information age in which we live, do you think there are better ways of communicating that might be different to and or in addition to hard copy letters sent by snail mail?
Absolutely, and we live in an electronic age, and many women, are using modern technology, but many WASPI women are not using modern technology. Some of them have trouble, copy and pasting a letter or accessing those kind of services. So I think there needs to be a variety of communication channels. But crucially, I think the letter is absolutely essential. All the information that you must do something about this. The advertising campaign that did happen was very vague. It wasn't specific about the increase of the state pension age. Otherwise, far more of us would have known. So, crucial information given clearly in a variety of ways, accurate and up to date on the website, that kind of thing, would be the right thing.
And I guess just playing devil's advocate, given what you've said in terms of the campaign and it being vague in your words, is there anything else, do you think, that women might have done in terms of questioning that with government at the time?
At the time, up until 2016, on the landing page of the government's website, the DWP website, it stated that women's state pension was 60 and men's was 65. It was Ros Altman that changed that when we told her about it, because that is part of the evidence that women used. Now, as Debbie said, we weren't that computer savvy, but when we saw it on the official website, then, we believed it. We believed that. Those of us who were fortunate enough to be in government-owned companies with pension schemes. I mean, I worked for the post office up until 2004, and I got a benefit statement from the post office pension scheme saying all the benefits in that scheme were in addition to state pension benefits, because a lot of schemes operated this clawback position, but of course the government-owned pension schemes didn't. So there was plenty of information out there for people who telling them that the state pension age was 60. Yes, maybe they could have done more. There was emails at the time. Maybe we could have got emails. We certainly read emails, especially from official sources. And of course, for tomorrow's pensioners, maybe they should start using text. And, we find most of our women now have mobile phones, not necessarily laptop computers or desktops or anything like that. So actually, harvesting that generation of mobile phone users is perhaps a better way of communicating for the future. But we didn't even have mobile phones in our day, so that wouldn't have worked either.
No. It's very quick now. We know that most of our supporters follow us on social media and pick things up instantly. But it wasn't like that. And so as I said, the damage was done then, and moving forward it would be different.
Just going on to the PHSO's approach to remedy. So the government have argued that a compensation scheme, which would cost up to £10.5 billion, can't be justified in the circumstances, and that a scheme based on individual circumstances would take many, many years and require thousands of staff to process. So what's your view about that dilemma, if you like?
Well, they've talked about it not being good value for taxpayers. Yeah. We surveyed recently adults, a statistically sound survey conducted by Yonder on our behalf amongst 2,079 adults, and this survey was between 3rd and 5th of January 25. And the question we asked was, the government should follow the Ombudsman's recommendation to compensate WASPI women. Now, 74% of that population agreed with that statement. And in that 2,079 adults, amongst 18 to 65-year-olds, made up 70% of that. So 70% of working adults today are saying the government should afford it. They should pay us back. And that's, just down slightly from the 74% if you include pensioners. And of course, that argument also flies in the face of the Ombudsman's view that the availability of resources should not be a barrier to compensation. And resources have always been tight. It is difficult for the government to make these sort of compensation schemes. But with respect, that's the job. You're in the job, the government's in the job to fix things that have gone wrong. There have been other large-scale compensation schemes in recent years. For example, trusting in the pensions promise, very similar to our complaint. It was about lack of or incorrect information, which was judged to be maladministrative, and resulting injustice was remedied by financial payments. Now, a total of $12.5 billion was paid out under that scheme, and I'm sure times were difficult then. It's not really a fair thing to say. Because we're in a mess, you kind of have to pay for it, even though you've already suffered. You've already had injustices. I mean, what point is there of having a process where we can complain if our rights have been violated, if the government is then just going to say, no, tough, times are tough, it's not good enough?
We're mindful too that the government saved over £200 billion increasing the state pension age just for WASPI women, and so the amount of compensation that we're asking is just a tiny fraction of that, acknowledging that there was error and as redress for that.
I think what I was trying to just pull out was the tension between sort of a blanket compensation approach and something which was individualised, and how long and difficult that individual approach might be, and whether you've got any thoughts on the two, because they're quite different.
Well, one would be, yes, the direct financial loss would require women to provide some evidence, but the original scheme that we talked about previously when we spoke to the committee was that it should be a simple flat rate of payment related to the amount of notice that women had and how fast the rise was in their state pension age. So we think of it rather as a bell curve. So women at the beginning of the decade had the shortest time to wait. Women at the end of the decade had the longest length of notice, and it was the women in the middle who were most severely affected with the steepest rise and the shortest amount of notice. So the DWP know when they send the letters, they have all that information, and so it would be quite easy to pick out the level of injustice that women suffered within that decade. It's not enormously complicated, with the direct financial loss being separate, because that will take time, and we know that a WASPI woman is dying every 12 minutes, so we don't have time for a very long and complicated and drawn out process of applying for something. There isn't time. But we appreciate that for direct financial loss, that will take longer. But the first part of the compensation process could be simple and quick and sensitive in that way.
Thank you. John Mill.
Thank you. The government has stated both that it does not accept the Ombudsman's report and that even if it did, it doesn't have enough money to pay compensation anyway. This does feel like killing one bird with two stones. In the light of this very difficult news, do you see any way, what solutions or actions do you think you can take from this point?
The government did accept that there has been maladministration and provided the apology. The only bit that hasn't happened is the redress for the reasons that have already been discussed. We'll do what we have always done at every stage over the 10 years, is to take legal advice as to what our options are, and we'll continue to lobby and talk with our MPs and supporters that we have in Parliament, and we know that we have an enormous amount of support in Parliament. There was a debate last Wednesday where MPs from all parties spoke very passionately about their concern about the constitutional issue, that the decisions of the Ombudsman can be ignored, and questioning what's the point of the Ombudsman and how can that be right. And that's certainly something that WASPI women are asking, how can that be right? We have almost 150,000 women on Facebook, and the response was phenomenal. They were just completely amazed. And one of the MPs said when he heard, his jaw hit the floor. So it really was a shock, a nasty shock. And we haven't got over it yet, really.
And of course, the recommendation that hasn't been accepted is that it's for Parliament to decide, not the Department of Work and Pensions, not the government without consulting Parliament. So we feel, I mean, those MPs represent us. There are, around 6,000 more in some constituencies, less in others. And if our representatives in Parliament aren't given their say, then that kind of cuts out another aspect of democracy in terms of this particular decision.
And do you feel that whatever might be said about current finances, that the government should have left the door open for action in the future with where finances might be permitting?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Perhaps this year it might have been difficult for them to make that decision, but it shouldn't be unmade totally.
We've always been pragmatic and open to discussion and conversation, and we welcome those discussions and those conversations. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is that it's been said that 90% of WASPI women knew about the increase to their state pension age, and there isn't any evidence to back up that sum, and that statistic has been quoted by so many people, and WASPI women can't understand that either. So we would welcome if there was an opportunity for the Secretary of State to come and talk to you and explain how she reached that figure, because it's a mystery to us.
Very much agree with that, and I'll be talking about it in the next panel, in fact, but thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for coming to give evidence to the committee. We very much appreciate your testimony here, so thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. I was going to give you a formal introduction, but we'll start off. It's a pleasure to welcome the last panellist, the Deputy Ombudsman for the Parliamentary and Health Service. Ombudsman, and it's Karl Banister. So very warm welcome, Karl. I don't know if you want to say some opening remarks in terms of you, because you have another role as well, as apart from being the Deputy Ombudsman.
Yes, I'm Deputy Ombudsman at the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman. I'm also Director of Operations, Legal and Clinical, so I'm responsible for the entire casework operation. And in fact, I worked on the investigation into women's state pension age communication from the start. So I'll say that, and the other thing I wanted to say is just to convey the apologies of Rebecca Hilsenrath, who's the Ombudsman, who couldn't be here today, and I hope I can channel her to some extent. I know she's met you, and she really welcomes the interest of the committee in the issue, so thank you.
Thank you, thanks so much. So I just wanted to refer, first of all, if I may, to the statement that was made following the government statement by the Ombudsman, and it was a very magnanimous statement from the Ombudsman, and she was pleased that the government recognised mistakes had been made and made a commitment, and there had been a genuine commitment from the Secretary of State that this would never happen again. And I'm quoting from the statement. She said she looked forward to hearing about the action plan to take this forward, and in terms of the work with the government in this in the future. I just wondered if you'd heard from the government, if that offer had been taken up by yourselves.
I think so. We will take up that offer, definitely. We've, I think, started a conversation about a working party, but we're at the stage at the moment of terms of reference for that. So yes, we welcome the offer. I think I'd sort of say a couple of things. So I mean, magnanimous. Thanks for the sort of the description there. I think we sort of to unpack. We are pleased that the government has said yes, there was maladministration. We're pleased that the government has apologised. Those are the positives. That's the glass half full. On the other side, it's not helpful, in our view, that the government has then sort of undermined some of that in some of the ways it's responded in saying, but we don't accept that women didn't know, picking out some aspects of the surveys, but not all the surveys and so on women's knowledge. It would have been better if it had just been a straight, we accept maladministration. But that's where we are, and we are definitely going to work with the government. It is welcome. We are about two things. One of them is remedy where there's been injustice, yes, individual complaints, or in this case, groups of complaints. But the other massive thing for us is improvement for the future. And we're optimistic that we'll get somewhere with this. So that is very pleasing.
Thank you. So can I move on to that last point, and thinking about the 6 sample cases you took? Now, these were 6 selected samples, as I understand. Please correct me if I have this wrong, but 6 samples of a caseload of about 600, and you had to close it at that stage, but they were selected to represent the case types that you had from that 600. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's an unusual investigation for us, and we realised that we were going to be swamped with complainants. We didn't have the resources to handle that. And so we conducted an exercise to try and think about what themes we were seeing in the complaints, and then essentially to select the sample complainants that best reflected those themes, and then treat those complainants as the representatives of the whole group. So there's a chance that we didn't pick, we're bound not to have picked up every possible variation, but we did our best with the 600 to find those themes.
And on those 6 sample cases, and they were, I remember in the previous committee that we had details of them. Have you had indication from the government that they are looking to compensate those particular individual cases?
No, we haven't. And that is unusual. So there have been other investigations where we've made what you might call systemic recommendations alongside having an individual complainant. And in those cases, government has normally compensated the individual complainant. I can only speculate that because we've said remedy goes to Parliament, because we've said this is a broad-based remedy, that the DWP has taken the view that it won't do that. But they haven't.
Can I just refer you to another set of cases, and I think this was in terms of the DWP's handling of migration to employment support allowance. Does this, or if there wasn't redress provided to these 6 individual cases, would this be slightly different to the case around employment support allowance migration?
Well, there is so that in that case, that was a case where someone was incorrectly not given employment support allowance, and it was a very significant impact on the individual concerned. I think the remedy was around £19,000 for the individual, and they were in poverty. In that case, we'd said that we could see from the circumstances there were upwards of 118,000 people would be in the same position. And our recommendation to DWP was that they should fine those people, because what we'd seen was we'd had a single complaint about that, and that this was clearly a class of people who were not aware of their rights, and that was unsurprising in the circumstances, and the DWP should fine the complainants in those cases. They haven't done that. They have had more complaints since then, but not significant numbers. I suppose the difference is there was a direct establishable loss there. Whereas here what we've done is looked at our severity of injustice scale and said this is a loss of opportunity, this is people never knowing whether they could have done something different, and we have a way of dealing with that, which is we look at our severity of injustice scale. So it's a different kind of financial remedy, but essentially the same in the sense that we've set a figure and it is open to the department to pay that figure.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Karl, and thanks for joining us today, and thanks for the work of the PHSO on this matter over many years. My colleague Jill German asked a very similar question to Angela and Debbie at the previous panel, particularly linked to the report. So we know the initial report and subsequent report went without any action from the previous government, effectively put on a shelf and ignored. The DWP previously didn't accept the findings, but as the Chair and yourself have touched on, have now accepted that there was maladministration, have apologised and have committed to learning from that. How significant a step do you think that is, based on sort of the journey with this issue over a number of years?
Well, so how significant a step is it that the government's committed to learning? Essentially, is that the question?
And accepted the maladministration and apologised.
So I think it is really important. I think it is extremely problematic to have a parliamentary ombudsman that represents Parliament in scrutinising government, and for government to not accept its recommendation, its finding on maladministration, its pure finding. I think that is problematic, and it is very pleasing that we're not in that position, that that's moved on. I think it's very pleasing that government's committed to learning. That's crucial. We're nothing if we're not helping government to learn from previous mistakes. That's very important to us. I think you could overstate the learning government will do, because, I mean, if I can find it, it's not new that government's committed to communicating about pensions. So if we look at our report, you can quote from our report, sort of the first report we did, paragraph 51. This is going way back. This is going back to the time of the events. DWP said all information provided by DWP should be appropriate, relevant, correct, up-to-date, clear, concise, to the point, helpful and targeted. And it stated it's widely accepted that the department has a duty to give informational advice to inform the public about any new policies and developments that may affect them. And there's more. I could quote more, but it's the point I'm making there is it's not new that it's accepted. It's always been accepted that it's a responsibility in this context to communicate. What is good about this commitment is working with us to think about ways to do that better, and we really welcome that.
And obviously in a timely manner as well.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
Engagement must take place.
Absolutely, timely is everything.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Steve Darling.
Thank you. So in May, the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman stated that if the government was to do nothing with the report, then it could undermine or constitutionally undermine the organisation. Seeming that we're looking at half a loaf today, and it's probably the most significant part of the loaf that is the payment out to those affected. Have you been made a toothless tiger?
So it's obviously the headline cases make the news, but in I think 99.9% of our investigations there is full compliance with our recommendations. So that's whether it's an apology, policy change, financial remedy, all of it. So this is extremely unusual. But the headline cases are headline cases for a reason. They kind of set the tone. I think we're only a toothless tiger if Parliament steps away from supporting us when there isn't compliance. The way the legislation is set up envisages this relationship where we make a report, departments are not obliged to implement our recommendations, but they are obliged to be accountable to Parliament as long as Parliament makes sure that happens. And if that does happen, then I don't think there's a constitutional problem. So the reference to a constitutional problem, I think it was me that said it. My reference there was, at that time, it felt unclear what was happening on the back of the report.
Thank you. And would it be helpful if it was legislated that government should accept findings of the Ombudsman full stop?
That sounds simple, but we have never asked for that. And the reason we've never asked for that is because we are not a regulator, and it starts to bring with it tinges of regulation. All organisations where there is enforceability in effect of recommendations, litigation becomes a much bigger factor. You see that across the piece. So it's something we've never asked for. It's something, obviously, we're not the only ones. Whether we ask or not, Parliament has its own view about these things. Of course it does. But for what it's worth, I've pointed out that in most cases, the vast majority of cases, there is compliance. And actually compliance is very high, the highest in organisations we have the most to do with. So the health service, virtually, I can't think of a case where we haven't had compliance in a health service case, where we do 80% of our work. So we haven't asked for that, and I think it brings a whole lot of things with it. It's quite a complex question.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Mill.
Thank you, Chair. The government has said, and I quote, that you did not properly take into account all the relevant evidence. In particular, it was claimed that 90% of women understood the change in 2006, but that was a survey based on a sample of just 170 women and is contradicted by multiple other figures. For example, the DWP found in 2007 that 50% of women whose pension age had risen to between 60 and 65 still thought it was just 60. In view of this, do you think that it was reasonable for the Secretary of State to use the 90% figure again and again as key justification for not paying compensation?
So I think it's not ideal, because I think it's clear from our report that there are various ways of looking at awareness, and that the ways that the department itself deployed at the time had lower figures for awareness than that. And in the end, the fundamentals are here in making a decision. DWP itself, at the time, knew that women did not know who they wanted to know, which was contradictory to their statement about how they operate that I read out earlier. So it accepts women didn't know, and actually, in a way, it's a red herring about the numbers. It accepts women that didn't know. It accepted at the time, and it had identified that and thought it should do something about it. The whole case, the whole investigation is simply about that. DWP knew that was not what it wanted, and it didn't act on what it itself said it should do at the time. That's the maladministration. So it's not helpful to introduce a debate about the numbers of people, because it's accepted the maladministration. I think then there's a sort of conversation about whether and how, if you accept this maladministration, you accept people affected by that maladministration, how you factor in cost into the need to do justice. And remembering that a scheme, you've had conversations earlier about what sort of scheme you might apply, that the cost of a scheme doesn't have to be the flat rate scheme across the piece, the £10 billion cost scheme. There are ways to limit the cost of scheme by the way it's applied, and I can talk a bit more about that if that's useful.
We probably don't have time on that right now, but I have to. I think the 90% figure is relevant because it affects the scale of the problem. If it's one person we've maladministrated, that's not really an issue. So, but another key issue in the debate has been the impact or otherwise of sending letters. Should earlier letters have been sent, etc. And the government has said that it wouldn't have made a difference. But writing letters is exactly how the government continues to communicate many important issues to this day. So do you think it was a reasonable objection, given that it's still standard practice to use letters?
So I think it was Angela or Debbie said it much better than I could. The government at the time considered the right thing to do was to send letters to people to increase awareness. It didn't do it. That's the maladministration. And it's quite difficult to point back and say, actually, we don't think letters would have worked. The whole point about communicating, and we find this with complainants too who come to us, is that you have to respect that people have all sorts of different ways they receive information, and that different demographics have different preferences, and you will find, of course, you'll be able to find all sorts of people who were aware. We know that, but we also know that many people engage in different ways, and letters are a key part of doing that. And I think I think it was Debbie who said, a brown envelope that says official things. Most people read it. That's why the DWP itself at the time said we should write to women.
Yes. Indeed, we talked about these days you might send a text, and the texts have an impact because they're personalised, and that is, I think the figures have not distinguished between generic letters and saying this is you, this is your particular issue. But thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I think David Pinto-Duchensky wants to follow up.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this issue. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things. You mentioned starting with the numbers, and you said that the debate on numbers was neither here nor there. I mean, reading your report, I mean, you started with a statement earlier that it's widely accepted that it's the responsibility of government to communicate changes. I think everyone agrees that. And from reading elements of your report, it sounds like you accept that overall changes were communicated. So, for instance, paragraph 115 says unpublished research found 85% of women aged 48 to 59 did know the pension age was changing. Similarly, paragraph 99 cites different research, showed that 73% of respondents aged 45 to 54 again knew it changed. But it feels like, again, reading your report, your core point on this is that although they knew that there was a change, they didn't understand fully that it applied to them. And so your position is that it's the government's obligation not just to inform that there's a change, but to tell people how future changes might affect them personally. Is that a kind of correct understanding of your position?
I think that's fair. And I should say, we're not telling government what its policy position should be on telling people things. We're holding government to its policy position on telling people things. Government itself said, this is our role, we should do this. It's open. I mean, the Revenue and Customs don't have the same policy position. They don't have a position that we should tell everyone about every tax change in advance. And that's, we hold government to the standards it sets itself generally.
So, but then can I pick up on that? Because it sounds like you accept government did inform people broadly that there was a change. It was your argument was that it failed to inform them exactly how it would affect them each individually, which to your point about HMRC absolutely doesn't do. So what do you think the role of the state is, and what do you think the role of the individual is once they're aware a change is happening to actually inform themselves about how it will affect them personally?
Well, I mean, I don't think they're in contradiction. So individuals have individual responsibility to learn about things that affect them. Government has a responsibility to this is very reductive, but the government, as we see it, has a responsibility to do what it says it's going to do. And if it doesn't like what it says it's going to do, to change what it says it's going to do, to think about that, to adjust its policy. Here, DWP said it was going to communicate changes that affected people, and that was the right thing to do. Those were publicly available statements. it believed it wasn't doing it correctly. It talked to itself about that. It informed itself about that. It said we should do some things differently, and then it just didn't do them. So that's what our finding is. Our finding isn't saying that people don't have their own responsibilities to inform themselves, but we're saying that government ought to behave in a way that is administratively correct and in accordance with our principles of good administration, which it didn't do in this case, and it's accepted that.
And I suppose the second question, and it's pick up on John's point about the kind of two pivots. So that was your first argument. Your second argument was around the efficacy of letters, and I take the point that DWP itself said that it should have sent letters. But I suppose part of this comes back to what was the material impact that might have had. What evidence did you draw on to look at, to inform your view that sending letters would have made a material difference?
So actually, we didn't really. I suppose we didn't really go there. So really, the point for us. And again, I think I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it's nuance here. But the point for us was government felt at the time that it needed to send letters, that was the right way to improve awareness, and then it just didn't do it. So what we haven't done, we haven't tried to substitute a view as to what the right way is to communicate with people. That's not for us. That's for the DWP applying its expertise. But in this case, it had applied its expertise. It had worked out what it ought to do. That was writing letters, and it just didn't do it. So we're not actually offering an opinion on whether that was the best way to do it. We're saying you've said it was the best way to do it, and you didn't do it.
Then just following up, and we'll come to this in a second, but then you do impute a level essentially of loss from that. So you must have some view on what the impact was of that. Otherwise, how did you arrive at a view on compensation? So
we looked at the 6 sample cases, and in those cases we could see that, with variation between the complainants, that where they were not aware, what they were left with was the uncertainty. Had they been aware, had they received a letter which had informed them, they may have done something differently. And so that's the loss we talked about. That it's a loss of opportunity. And that is that you can't value that, but we do value it, and we value against a scheme we have which sets out how we should value it.
But implicit in that was a view that then a letter would have made a major difference, right? Because you're imputing that they would have taken the information and acted on it, and that's exactly that's evidence you didn't look at.
Yeah. So, and if we'd been thinking about, if we were thinking about a way to compensate, now we talked about one way is to simply say if you were in this category, here's a flat payment. But it would be open to say, actually, did you know? It would be open to, as a condition precedent, for someone to have to swear that they didn't know. That's perfectly reasonable, because the point about what we're saying is you've not lost out if in fact you did know, and we know that lots of people did.
Thank you. Jo Baxter.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a very similar question to the one that I asked of the previous panel, which is about the compensation scheme that the government have said would cost £10.5 billion that they say cannot be justified in the circumstances, and that a scheme that was based on individual circumstances would take many, many years and thousands of staff to process. Do you accept that there's a dilemma there? And I think you mentioned in response to one of the previous questions that you had other ideas about what the government could do, and I wonder if you would share those with us.
Yes, I suppose, again, of course there is a dilemma there. DWP are not funded for this, I assume, and that creates a dilemma. But I think we're not. So ordinarily, we respect the expertise of organisations to make conclusions about remedies. So here we've said public bodies should in effect we've said Parliament should ask DWP to make a proposal about a scheme. It doesn't have to be exactly what we've said. We tend to believe, as I've said, that the organisation is going to be more expert than us in working through what that might be. We understand the reservations about a simple flat rate scheme for the reasons I've set out earlier, but there are ways to be more proportionate. WASPI have offered, and they are not the only stakeholder in this, they're not the only stakeholder group, but they've offered to talk to government about what a scheme would look like. They've made suggestions. I'm not supporting or not supporting those, but it is out there. What is clear to me, what I think would be clear to anyone, is that any scheme would want to avoid burdensome investigations for the reasons that DWP have said. I would not be suggesting, if I were asked, that DWP do what I suggested in relation to the ESA case, where we recommended directly that DWP should find the complainants. This is not a similar case. There's been lots of publicity. It wouldn't seem proportionate to me to ask DWP to find people. People should come to DWP. That in itself becomes a reducer of the numbers. I think the assumption would be that people should contact DWP. I think applicants would have to say that they didn't know about the changes, because what is the point of compensating someone for lost opportunity if they did know? I think they'd have to give some sort of statement about why they didn't know and what the impact on them was. And I think DWP would think about a sort of proportionate, transparent criteria about how it assessed those applications. And that might include the possibility of a phone call to discuss the claim. I thought, I'm not designing a scheme, but what I'm saying is I think it would be interesting for DWP, rather than simply say it's too difficult, to give a bit more detail on why it's too difficult and what they've considered.
Thank you. Amanda, did you want to follow up?
Just to quickly follow up on that, thank you for coming on. I appreciate we're running out of time. So are you aware of any other options for financial redress that were costed and considered by DWP before it came to its decision? And on the other side, did you consider alternatives?
So on the first question, no, I'm not aware. We didn't have a conversation with DWP before they made the statement, or at least not a specific conversation about what they were going to say. And on our positioning, it kind of felt, we knew DWP wasn't going to comply with the report, and so I think we pushed it towards Parliament because we knew that's where we'd end up. But what we didn't do, because we couldn't get the sort of conversation we'd like to have, if we were recommending a remedy in a case like this, we'd be having quite a detailed conversation with the organisation to try and get the remedy right. So it's not a question of we simply investigate and then we tell the organisation what they should do. We investigate, we talk to the organisation, we come up with the provisional views, we talk to the organisation about that, we talk to them about the remedy and whether it's achievable, and we adjust based on that feedback. We couldn't have that conversation in this case, so no, we didn't come up with an alternative to what we said.
Okay, so you couldn't have that dialogue. Was there a particular reason why that couldn't take place?
So at the time when we were concluding the investigation, DWP were in a position that we shouldn't be making findings about this at all. They've moved on from that, which is absolutely welcome, but that's where they were at the time.
Remind us of the time there, Karl. So when you presented it to Parliament, it was beginning of last year, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. David.
Thank you, and I'll be very mindful of time, Chair. So look, just building on Amanda and Joanna's question, so you've mentioned that you thought there might have been another route through rather than just flat scheme compensation. Did you make any attempt to cost that?
The people who need to cost that is DWP. I think we haven't attempted to cost that because we haven't had that sort of conversation. We're open to a conversation about that.
And because obviously looking at the kind of grand scheme and stepping back, the flat rate scheme, which you do mention and kind of place a range on, comes to between 3.5 and about 10 billion, which at the upper end is about 60% of the total policing budget for England and Wales for a year. As part of putting together your findings, did you make any assessment of proportionality or affordability?
So, that's a philosophical question in some ways about what is an ombudsman for. So, in the end, we're here to stand aside from government and take an impartial view about maladministration in particular contexts. I think we, of course, are conscious of the financial context for organisations that we investigate, but we also do have to make findings. If we sort of pull away from saying there's a potential for a significant finding here, a significant remedy, therefore we won't investigate this, that starts to undermine our position. I think that's part of the reason why I think Steve Darling asked before about the sort of whether we should have enforcement. I think it's part of the whole push and pull an environment we work in that we make a recommendation, it's not automatic, it's going to be followed. It's for government to think about proportionality. So no, that isn't to say we're not conscious of the environment. We do have to, without fear or favour, call out maladministration when we see it.
Thank you. I'm going to move on, if that's all right, David. Steve Darling.
Thank you. And I'm afraid I feel a little bit like a French aristocrat at the time of the French Revolution, afraid of the guillotine.
No guillotine. Keep going, Steve.
But I didn't really understand, and can you unpick this a bit further, why there wasn't that conversation with the DWP to try and find a deliverable compensation scheme. And then my further question, when you've unpicked that a little bit further, which would be really helpful because I'm struggling, the other bit was, were you surprised that the Secretary of State didn't actually come forward with an alternative scheme in light of those discussions not happening?
So the context was that we were completely, it was a long investigation, and throughout the investigation we had understood that DWP felt that we were getting it wrong, and so there was a kind of
a culture.
Yeah, we actually, as an organisation, we were, if you'll recall, we were judicially reviewed by WASPI at one point during the process. So there was a sort of higher level of focus on just getting the investigation right, getting the analysis of maladministration right, with a sense we could, challenge could come from any quarter. There wasn't a sense that we were having a strong dialogue about what might happen afterwards. And in the context, we may have pursued this more, except that given that we were being clearly told that DWP wasn't going to accept the report, it didn't seem it wasn't going to be that productive to try and have a conversation about something that wasn't accepted it should happen at all. Does that?
Yep, no, that's helpful.
And then the second question was,
are you surprised that the Secretary of State didn't come forward with some form of resolution, financial resolution, in light of what happens in other places around these?
I suppose not really, because it was a significant development, a significant move forward to accept maladministration, full stop, and to apologise. Those are significant things. So was I surprised that there wasn't also a discussion about a scheme? No, I wasn't, but I still felt that was a significant change, and it changes the debate and it moves the conversation potentially onto that in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And final question to David.
And so, thank you, Karl, for spending so much time talking to us. I suppose, stepping back from all of this, kind of what are the lessons you draw? What kind of changes do you want to see the department make? But also, are there any changes that you think the Ombudsman should be making in response to some of the criticism and some of this interaction?
So for the department, I think, I don't want to anticipate the conversations we're going to have. I think that for the department, I think that always focusing on the users of the service, trying to think about what they need, trying to think about, doing something now is better than not than in the future. So the lesson from this investigation is, had they done what they thought they should have done, it wouldn't have been that expensive at the time, and we wouldn't be in this position now, and these women wouldn't have these regrets that they have now. So working on that, working with the department to more consistently behave in the right way is something that I think we can take from this. For us, I think we were on the record as saying we might not. We did a very unusual thing in this investigation. We intended to be a 3-stage investigation. So we looked at maladministration issue by itself first of all, and then considered injustice and remedy. I don't think we'll do that again. It seemed to us at the time to be the right thing to kind of separate out the issues, but it kind of confused the story. I think it took longer than it should have done. It meant that each stage was argued about rather than it being argued about as a totality. So we definitely wouldn't do that again. I think we thought about some aspects of the way we organise the team. We are anyway improving our approach to systemic investigations. We didn't have a systemic investigations team at the time. We do now. So there's certainly learning we've taken from the approach. We don't want to take 6 years to do an investigation like this again.
Thank you so much, Karl. It's been a pleasure to have you before the committee today. And that completes this evidence session for the Pensioner Poverty Inquiry. Order, order.